Imagine walking into an interrogation room. Across from you sits someone who doesn't need a baseline to know you're lying. They aren't tracking your micro-expressions or measuring the microscopic sweat on your fingertips with a polygraph machine. They don't have to. They feel the exact chemical shift happening inside your body before you've even finished forming the thought in your conscious mind. In the study of human behavior, we spend years learning how to read people, how to decipher the hidden tells of deception, power dynamics, and hidden motives. But there is a specific profile of human being that possesses an innate biological radar for these hidden frequencies. We call them empaths. To the untrained eye, the empath looks like an easy target. In a room full of dominant, competitive personalities, they are the ones leaning back, absorbing the room, offering validation, and showing deep, uncalculated kindness. If you operate from a predatory mindset, your brain immediately flags this person as low utility, high compliance. You think you can push their boundaries. You think you can take their emotional capital, manipulate their perspective, or use their kindness as a stepping stone. You assume that because they have a long fuse, they don't possess an explosive charge. That is the single most dangerous miscalculation you can make in a social interaction. What the predator, the narcissist, or the casual manipulator fails to realize is that the empath's kindness is a choice, not a lack of options. It is a manifestation of immense psychological strength. When you target an empath, you aren't just breaking a rule of social etiquette. You are actively triggering a high-stakes psychological defense mechanism. Every time you lie to them, every time you subtly shift the blame, every time you exploit their patience, they aren't just taking it, they are processing it. They are cataloging it. Their brain is building an undeniable, highly accurate profile of your deepest insecurities and your exact behavioral mechanics. They see the real you, the fragile, terrified child hiding behind the mask of control. And then the threshold is reached. Most people expect a loud argument, tears, or a dramatic confrontation when someone is pushed too far. With a true empath, you get none of that. You get something far more terrifying: absolute, clinical silence. In a fraction of a second, your access to their emotional ecosystem is permanently revoked. If you have ever wondered why people spiral into a state of profound anxiety, confusion, and desperate regret after burning a bridge with an empath, it isn't because of voodoo or magic. It is pure, raw, behavioral psychology. In the speech that follows, we are going to strip away the mystical fluff and analyze the exact mechanics of what happens when you cross that line. You will understand the biological reality of emotional absorption, the terrifying nature of the Empath Door Slam, and why the psychological fallout of hurting one of these individuals is designed to leave an permanent mark on your psyche. If you think you can play games with someone who reads your soul like an open book, you are about to find out exactly why that game always ends in total defeat. Every single day, we step into a hyperverbal, deeply manipulative world. We wear masks, we calculate our moves, and we try to project versions of ourselves that hide our deepest vulnerabilities. Most people are completely blind to this hidden theater. But there is a specific group of individuals walking among us who see right through the stage production. They are hyper-attuned to the emotional frequencies of the human animal. We call them empaths. If you have ever watched an expert interrogator completely dismantle a suspect without ever raising their voice, you have seen a fraction of what an empath can do naturally. They don't just see your behavior, they absorb it. Now, if you are listening to this right now because you think empaths are just fragile, overly sensitive people who need to be protected from the harsh realities of the world, I need you to put that assumption aside immediately. That belief is a catastrophic psychological blind spot, and it is the exact reason so many people end up facing a level of psychological regret they are completely unequipped to handle. Over the next few minutes, we are going to break down the cold, clinical reality of what happens when you mistreat, manipulate, or push an empath past their breaking point. We are going to look under the hood of the human mind to see the exact behavioral mechanics of the empath door slam, a psychological phenomenon so absolute it simulates a state of existential isolation for the person left behind. If you want to understand how real human influence works and why the quietest person in the room often holds the most dangerous amount of psychological leverage, you need to hear every single word of what comes next. Let's look at the baseline. When a typical manipulator encounters an empath, they see someone who is warm, accommodating, and deeply giving. In the language of behavioral profiling, this looks like a green light. The manipulator thinks, here is an endless well of emotional validation. Here is someone I can lie to, someone I can gaslight, someone who will keep forgiving me because they hate conflict. What is actually happening? The empath is running an unconscious data collection process. Because their mirror neurons are highly active, they are feeling your anxiety, your shame, and your hidden malice. They know you are lying the moment the words leave your mouth. The pitch of your voice, the microscopic delay in your structural responses, the subtle shifts in your physical proximity, their system processes all of it. Yet they choose to give you a pass. They give you what we call behavioral credit. They extend their patience because they can see the wounded, insecure parts of you that drive your toxic behavior. They treat you with kindness not because they are blind to your games, but because they are hoping your baseline will correct itself. While you think you are successfully playing them, a dangerous shift is occurring beneath the surface. Every single infraction, every covert insult, and every instance of emotional exploitation is being compiled. The empath's mind is inadvertently creating an exhaustive psychological map of your entire personality matrix. They learn exactly what drives your ego, they identify the precise roots of your insecurities, and they recognize the exact mechanisms you use to protect your fragile self-image. They know you better than you know yourself because they are observing you without the distorting lens of your own self-deception. This is a period of immense risk for the abuser. But because the empath remains kind and patient, the abuser becomes arrogant. They increase the intensity of their manipulation, completely unaware that they are walking deeper into a psychological trap of their own making. Human tolerance is a finite resource, even for the most profound empaths. But unlike standard personalities who react incrementally, getting a little angrier or more confrontational with each fight, the empath's tolerance scale operates on a binary loop. It is a 0 or a 100. It is on or it is completely off. You can push, pull, lie, and take advantage for months or even years, and it will appear as though nothing is changing. But you are tracking a fuse that is burning inside an enclosed space. The moment your behavior hits that final, definitive psychological threshold, the moment you display a structural lack of empathy or a piece of malice that cannot be rationalized, the fuse hits the powder. There is no screaming match. There is no crying. There is no dramatic, cinematic confrontation. The emotional circuit breaker simply trips. What happens next is what behavioral psychologists refer to as the absolute door slam. In a matter of seconds, the empath's emotional investment in your existence drops to absolute 0. The mirror neurons switch off regarding your frequency. They no longer care about your pain, they no longer care about your excuses, and they no longer care about your perspective. When this happens, the empath doesn't seek revenge. Revenge requires emotional energy, and you are no longer deemed worthy of a single watt of their psychological power. Instead, they look right through you. They treat you with a polite, detached, clinical neutrality that is colder than any hatred you have ever experienced. You are transformed from a primary focus in their life into a complete stranger, a background object, a non-entity. This is where the profound regret begins to manifest for the person who caused the harm. Human beings are deeply reliant on emotional feedback loops. The manipulator specifically feeds entirely on the reactions and validation of their target. When an empath cuts you off, they don't just leave your life, they take the mirror with them. Suddenly, the manipulator is left standing in a profound psychological vacuum. The constant stream of unearned grace, understanding, and emotional buffering is gone. For the first time, you are forced to sit alone in a room with the raw, ugly, unvarnished reality of your own actions. You try to provoke a reaction, you get nothing. You try to apologize, the words bounce off a wall of absolute indifference. The regret you feel isn't because the empath attacked you, it's because they stopped protecting you from yourself. You are left to suffocate under the weight of your own toxicity. Let this serve as a definitive behavioral warning. Never mistake a person's patience for a lack of sight, and never mistake their kindness for a lack of a spine. When you target an empath, you are playing a high-stakes psychological game where you are completely outmatched. Treat their empathy with the absolute respect it commands, because once that door slams shut, there is no lockpicker in the world who can open it again. The deceptive illusion of softness is perhaps the most profound systemic error made by toxic, narcissistic, or predatory personalities when they interface with a true empath. From a clinical perspective, human behavior is often categorized through a lens of dominance and submission, power and vulnerability. When an individual enters a room and projects a non-threatening, collaborative posture, defaulting to deep listening, offering emotional validation, and choosing harmony over conflict, the primitive structures of the predatory brain instantly flag this person as low utility and high compliance. They perceive this gentleness as a structural defect, a lack of psychological armor, or an innate inability to defend personal boundaries. This is not merely a surface-level misunderstanding, it is a fundamental misinterpretation of cognitive architecture. The empath's soft exterior is not a symptom of weakness or a lack of defensive options. It is a conscious, highly disciplined neurological choice. To process the world with that level of sensory and emotional acuity requires an immense amount of internal stability. An empath operates with an incredibly active mirror neuron system, meaning they are constantly absorbing and translating the subtle micro-expressions, vocal inflections, and autonomic shifts of the people around them. They are feeling the raw data of your hidden anxieties, your unstated anger, and your boiling insecurities. Navigating the world with that amount of intense external stimuli requires a tremendous amount of psychological fortitude. Therefore, when they choose to respond to a hyper-aggressive or manipulative world with kindness, it is an act of supreme emotional regulation, not a default setting of helplessness. The predator miscalculates because they project their own internal metrics onto the empath. In the mind of a manipulator, the only reason someone would tolerate poor treatment or offer unearned grace is because they are too terrified to fight back or too blind to see the manipulation. They assume that the empath's quietness is submission. They fail to understand that the empath is deliberately choosing to hold back their own psychological power in order to allow the relationship room to breathe. This illusion of softness creates a dangerous environment of false confidence for the aggressor. Because they encounter no immediate, violent resistance, they believe they are successfully dominating the dynamic. They increase their boundary violations, amplify their gaslighting tactics, and become increasingly reckless with their behavior, completely unaware that they are interacting with a hyper-aware observer who is tracking every move. The softness they think they are exploiting is actually a buffer zone. It is a psychological courtesy extended to the aggressor, giving them the space and the time to self-correct before drastic measures are taken. When you mistake an empath's willingness to absorb your emotional debris for an inability to stop you, you are misjudging the baseline entirely. It is equivalent to looking at a highly trained martial artist who chooses to keep their hands down in a verbal dispute and assuming they do not know how to strike. The non-aggressive stance is a manifestation of absolute control, not a lack of capability. The illusion of softness masks a highly analytical mind that is quietly evaluating your character, measuring your capacity for self-awareness, and testing whether you possess the basic human decency to respect a space that is not actively defended by force. By the time the manipulator realizes that this softness was actually a calculated choice of disciplined restraint, the psychological trap has already snapped shut, leaving them entirely exposed to a cold reality they never saw coming. The baseline shift, or what behavioral profilers recognize as the phenomenon of the long fuse, represents a critical divergence in how highly empathetic individuals manage interpersonal conflict compared to the rest of the population. In a standard social matrix, when a normal individual experiences a boundary violation, whether it is an overt insult, a subtle act of gaslighting, or a breach of trust, their psychological defense mechanisms trigger almost immediately. They offer immediate pushback, erect a sudden defensive wall, or engage in a direct, escalating argument. This immediate reactivity serves as an early warning system for the aggressor, signaling exactly where the boundary lines are drawn. But when you interface with a true empath, this standard reactive loop is entirely absent, creating a highly dangerous psychological anomaly for the manipulator. The empath possesses an expanded internal timeline for processing behavioral infractions. When a toxic personality inflicts emotional harm, the empath does not immediately retaliate or shut down. Instead, their neural network begins to absorb, deconstruct, and deeply analyze the behavior. They view the infraction through a lens of psychological contextualization, asking themselves why the person acted that way, looking past the surface malice to find the underlying trauma or insecurity that triggered the attack. This cognitive processing loop manifests externally as a prolonged period of silence, tolerance, and continued compliance. The manipulator, misreading this entirely, assumes their tactics have succeeded without consequence. What they are actually witnessing is the systematic extension of behavioral credit. The empath is actively loaning the aggressor emotional capital, giving them multiple opportunities to self-correct, apologize, or display a natural return to a healthy behavioral baseline. This long fuse is not a sign of emotional numbness. It is a period of intense internal observation. While the manipulator becomes increasingly bold and sloppy, assuming they have found a target with no psychological limits, the empath is tracking the cumulative weight of the infractions. They are observing whether these toxic behaviors are isolated incidents driven by temporary stress, or if they represent a structural, unyielding pattern of malicious intent. This baseline shift masks the true danger of the situation because it creates a false sense of security. The aggressor feels completely unthreatened because the consequences of their actions are delayed. They do not realize that the empath's mind operates like a highly precise ledger. Every time a boundary is crossed and met with quiet patience, a line is written in that ledger. The empath is continuously recalculating the statistical probability of the relationship's survival, shifting their internal baseline deeper and deeper into a state of emotional detachment. This prolonged tolerance is essentially a buffer zone designed to give the abuser every possible chance to redeem themselves. However, because the fuse is so exceptionally long, the manipulator loses all sense of situational awareness. They forget that even the longest fuse eventually reaches the explosive charge. They become habituated to the empath's grace, treating it as a permanent atmospheric condition rather than a temporary depleting resource. They completely fail to recognize that the lack of immediate blowback is actually a countdown. By expanding their timeline of tolerance, the empath ensures that when the final break inevitably occurs, it will not be a sudden emotional overreaction that they might later regret or reverse. It will be a completely rationalized, deeply considered, and permanent systemic shutdown based on an overwhelming mountain of compiled behavioral data that the manipulator foolishly believed had been forgotten. The assessment and data aggregation phase is the silent turning point where the power dynamic between a manipulator and an empath completely reverses, entirely unbeknownst to the aggressor. During the prolonged period of tolerance, the time when the manipulator believes they are successfully exploiting a weak target, the empath's mind is not merely suffering or passively enduring the behavior. Instead, their heightened cognitive and emotional faculties are operating like a highly advanced intelligence-gathering apparatus. They are running a continuous, subconscious diagnostic on the manipulator's entire psychological infrastructure. Because an empath possesses an acute sensitivity to human behavior, they are not just looking at the words being spoken or the overt actions being taken. They are collecting raw behavioral data on the micro level. The subtle shifts in eye contact when a lie is told, the specific vocal frequencies that signal hidden insecurity, the defensive posturing used to deflect blame, and the precise timing of manipulation tactics. They map out the aggressor's psychological blind spots with absolute clinical precision. They identify exactly what the manipulator is running from, what deep-seated trauma they are trying to compensate for, and what specific triggers cause their ego to fracture. This is a process of extreme data accumulation. The empath begins to understand the manipulator's behavioral mechanics better than the manipulator understands themselves. They see the real, fragile, terrified entity that is hiding behind the loud mask of control and dominance. While the manipulator is busy celebrating their perceived victory, thinking they have successfully gaslit or controlled the empath, they are actually providing the empath with an exhaustive, step-by-step manual on how to dismantle their entire persona. Every interaction becomes a data point. Every cruel remark becomes a revelation of an internal deficit. Every attempt at emotional manipulation reveals the exact boundary of the manipulator's own psychological stability. This data aggregation is entirely non-malicious during its initial phase. The empath collects this information instinctively, driven by a deep desire to understand the root cause of the toxicity so they can navigate around it or help heal it. They are looking for the behavioral levers that might lead to a breakthrough or a positive change. However, because this process happens quietly beneath a veneer of continued kindness and accommodation, the manipulator remains completely oblivious to the fact that they are being thoroughly profiled. They do not realize that their psychological armor is being systematically stripped away, layer by layer, in the mind of the person they are mistreating. The empath is cataloging the manipulator's reliance on specific reactions, noticing exactly how much validation the manipulator requires, how they use guilt to maintain leverage, and what specific emotional frequencies they feed on to sustain their inflated sense of self. This massive accumulation of psychological data transforms the empath from a perceived victim into the most dangerous person in the room. They hold the complete blueprint to the manipulator's ego. They know exactly which pillars hold up the aggressor's false self-image and precisely where the structural fault lines lie. By allowing the manipulator to act without immediate consequence, the empath grants them the rope to hang themselves behaviorally, watching without intervention as the toxic individual repeatedly demonstrates their true nature, fully documenting a psychological profile that will soon be used to execute a total and permanent behavioral severance. The absolute door slam represents the sudden, clinical execution phase of the empath's behavioral defense mechanism, marking the exact moment the accumulated data meets the unyielding wall of the final threshold. To the outside observer or the blind-sided manipulator, this event appears completely anomalous, a sudden, shocking shift from total compliance to absolute emotional zero. However, from a psychological standpoint, it is the completely logical result of a binary circuit breaker tripping within the empath's mind. When that final boundary violation occurs and the internal ledger balances out to a definitive negative, the empath does not experience an emotional explosion. There's no screaming, no chaotic shedding of tears, and no desperate attempt to get the last word in a toxic argument. Those reactive behaviors require emotional energy, and at the precise microsecond of the door slam, the empath's emotional investment in the manipulator drops to absolute zero. The mirror neurons that were previously hyper-attuned to the manipulator's frequency are instantly reprogrammed to treat them as background noise. The empath completely revokes the manipulator's clearance to their internal ecosystem. This is a cold, calculated behavioral severance that alters the fundamental reality of the relationship instantly. The manipulator is suddenly locked out of the very psychological sanctuary they had been casually exploiting for months or years. What makes this phenomenon so terrifying to the toxic personality is the complete absence of hatred or malice from the empath. Hatred is still a form of attachment. It is a dark manifestation of caring. The empath offers something far more devastating: absolute indifference. When they look at the manipulator post-door slam, they look right through them with the polite, detached neutrality one reserves for a stranger on a crowded subway or a piece of office furniture. The manipulator tries to initiate the old toxic loops, using guilt, anger, gaslighting, or sudden love bombing to provoke a reaction, but they find that their words bounce off an impenetrable, invisible wall. The empath answers with clinical brevity, refuses to engage in emotional subtext, and displays a terrifying lack of facial reactivity. The sudden, total withdrawal of emotional validation creates an immediate, violent psychological vacuum for the manipulator. Because their ego relies entirely on exploiting the empath's emotional feedback loop to stabilize itself, the absolute cutoff causes an immediate internal destabilization. The manipulator is left clawing at empty air, realizing that every text message left unread, every unreturned glance, and every calm, monotone response is a definitive sign that they no longer possess a single ounce of influence over this person. The door slam is entirely irreversible because it is not based on a temporary emotional whim or a passionate outburst. It is built on the massive foundation of compiled behavioral data from the assessment phase. The empath has already processed the grief, rationalized the ending, and closed the case file on the relationship before the manipulator even realizes a boundary was crossed. The boundary is no longer a line drawn in the sand that can be negotiated or stepped over. It has been replaced by a concrete vault door. By executing this severance with absolute silence and clinical detachment,